October 1878 began with a heavy silence on the porch of the cabin. Broken only by the rhythmic thud of a heavy boot against the timber, Clara stood by the door, her hands still damp from the morning's lie, as Miller adjusted his hat and looked out toward her small paddock. Miller was a man of cold assessments, a rancher who viewed the valley as a ledger of assets and liabilities. The ultimatum he delivered was not a suggestion. It was a decree backed by the territorial council's new ordinance regarding livestock safety. The wolves had taken for colts from the northern range in a single week, and the local authorities had decided that any animal not secured in a registered fortified structure by the first hard freeze would be seized for the regional stagecoach line. Miller's voice was a flat and yielding drone as he explained that her 3 horses were considered a public nuisance because their presence lured the pack closer to the settled areas. He gave her 21 days to build a standard timber barn with a double-walled perimeter, an impossible task for a 31-year-old widow with no access to a mill and no funds to hire a crew. It was a calculated move to strip her of her only means of transportation and labor, forcing her to abandon the claim she had spent 3 years holding. The physics of the situation were stacked against her. A barn required 2,000 board feet of seasoned pine, 400 pounds of iron hardware, and a team of 6 men working 14-hour shifts. Claire had none of those things. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, and a memory of how things were braced in the deep copper mines where her father had spent his life. As Miller turned to leave, he glanced at the flat rocky ground around her cabin and remarked that she should start packing her trunk before the frost set in. He did not see a construction site. He saw a foreclosed future. Clara did not argue, as the point was not to convince him of her capability. The point was to ensure that by the time the snow fell, there would be nothing for the law or the wolves to find. The cabin Clara occupied sat on a peculiar geological shelf, a detail her father, Owen, would have noted with a quiet nod of approval. He had been a man of the earth, a Cornish miner who understood that the strongest structures were not those built against the sky, but those integrated into the foundation of the world. He had taught her that a mountain doesn't fall because it understands the distribution of weight, and that the most efficient way to stay warm was to let the planet itself provide the insulation. This wasn't about luck, it was about the thermal mass of the soil. Her husband Ben had built the cabin on a slight rise of compacted clay and limestone, thinking only of drainage. He had seen the land as a surface to be conquered, but Claire saw it as a volume to be utilized. In the days following Miller's visit, she began to map the area beneath her floorboards. The cabin's footprint was 24 feet by 18 feet, resting on a perimeter of dry stack stone. Below that lay a layer of dense, frost-resistant clay that descended 8 feet before hitting the bedrock. She spent her nights calculating the cubic yardage of earth she would need to relocate. To house 3 horses comfortably, she needed a space 12 feet wide and 20 feet long with a ceiling height of at least 7 feet. That meant moving nearly 1,700 cub-feet of soil. She did not start by digging a hole in the yard where everyone could see. Instead, she pried up the heavy floorboards in the center of her living room. The open loop was created the moment she dropped the first bucket into the dark. Her neighbors, passing on the road, noticed that she wasn't hauling timber from the mill. They saw no stacks of lumber, heard no rhythmic hammering of nails, and saw no rising skeleton of a barn. They saw only a woman who seemed to be spending her days cleaning her house and moving small piles of dirt to the creek behind her property. The community assumed she had given up, that she was merely tidying her affairs before the deadline arrived. They did not realize that the dirt she carried away was the volume of a hidden sanctuary, taking shape beneath her feet. The mechanism of survival that Clara relied upon was a principle her father had called the scent trap subterranean. He had explained it to her when she was 12, using a model made of damp sand and a candle. A wolf's primary tool is its nose, and a traditional barn acts like a chimney, venting the warm, musky scent of livestock into the cold air where it can be detected from miles away. To hide horses, one had to hide their breath. Clara's design utilized a dual ventilation system that mimicked the airflow of a deep shaft mine. She engineered a primary air intake that pulled through a buried stone culvert 50 feet from the cabin, allowing the air to be pre-warmed by the Earth's constant 55 temperature before it reached the animals. The exhaust, however, was the master stroke. Instead of a vertical chimney, she constructed a horizontal flue that ran through the subsoil and exited into the cabin's existing hearth. The horse's body, he would rise, be pulled into the flue by the natural draft of her evening fire, and there, scent would be incinerated by the flames or masked by the heavy smell of burning oak and pine. The horses would be invisible to the predators because they would essentially be breathing through the cabin's lungs. The physics were elegant and simple. Air moves from high pressure to low pressure, and scent follows the heat. She spent her third week reinforcing the ceiling of the stable, the floor of her home, using a series of inverted arches made of reclaimed limestone. She didn't use wood carvings or decorative beams. She used the raw, heavy geometry of the earth. Every stone was fitted with a friction lock that meant the more weight Miller or the snow put on the cabin, the tighter the underground stable would become. She measured the moisture content of the clay daily, ensuring it stayed at the perfect consistency to cure into a rock-hard shell. Not a single nail was used in the structural support. It was a system held together by gravity and the understanding that the earth wants to stay where it is put. The physical toll of the build was a matter of economic pragmatism. Every hour of digging was a calorie burned, and every calorie had to be replaced. By October 15th, Clarara's palms were a map of burst blisters and new yellowed callus. She worked in 14-hour cycles, digging from in the morning until noon, then hauling the dirt in a modified wheelbarrow to the creek under the cover of the afternoon fog, then spending the evening bracing the new sections with stone. The ramp was the most difficult part. It had to be steep enough to remain hidden, but gradual enough for a horse to navigate without panic. She carved it in a gentle spiral, starting from a hidden thicket of brush 30 yards behind the cabin, tunneling inward until it met the basement level. She lined the floor of the tunnel with 6 inches of pack sand and pine needles to deaden the sound of hooves. The horses, a sturdy buckskin, a bay mare, and a yearling, were moved in on the night of October 20th. She did not lead them. She baited them with oats, moving slowly, their breath blooming in the cooling air. Once they were inside the vaulted chamber, the temperature immediately stabilized. The horses didn't whinny. They seemed to sense the safety of the heavy earth around them. The stable was 7 warmer than the surface within an hour. She had installed a series of wooden pulleys to lift the final floorboards back into place. Ceiling the entrance from the outside. The cabin looked exactly as it had for years. There was no barn, no fence, and no sign of the 3 animals that were the center of her life. The deadline was 48 hours away. She sat in her chair by the hearth that night, listening to the muffled, rhythmic chewing of hay from beneath her feet. It was the sound of a system working. The horses were no longer assets in Miller's ledger. They were ghosts in the machinery of the valley. The social pressure intensified on the morning of the 22nd. Thomas, the local blacksmith, and a man whose word carried weight in the town council, rode up to the cabin with 2 other men. They were there to conduct the pre-winter inventory. Thomas was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one who believed that rules kept a community from fracturing. He dismounted and looked round the empty paddock, his eyes scanning the horizon for the horses or the barn that should have been there. He saw nothing but the cabin and the vast turning colors of the autumn brush. He asked where the horses were, and Clarara, standing on her porch with a cup of Corey, replied matter-of-factly that they were no longer a concern for the council. Thomas frowned, his skepticism evident in the way he kicked at the dirt. He told her that hiding them in the woods wouldn't work, that the wolves would find them by nightfall and the law would find her by morning. He warned her that Miller was planning to claim the land if she couldn't prove she had the means to secure her livestock. The dialogue was crisp and one-sided. Thomas said, "You can't fight the winter with a shovel." Clarara, "Where are they?" She simply gestured to the empty land and said, "They are where the wolves cannot reach them." That was the requirement, wasn't it? Thomas didn't believe her. He assumed she had sold them or driven them into the high canyons in a fit of grief-induced madness. He noted on his ledger that the property was void of livestock and therefore in compliance with the letter of the law, though he added a note that the owner was likely destitute and would not survive the season. He did not notice the faint rhythmic vibration under his boots as he walked back to his horse. He did not notice that the smoke coming from her chimney had a slightly different hue, carrying the invisible molecules of 3 warm horses through the fire. He left with a sense of pity, convinced that by January the cabin would be empty and the widow would be a memory. He was used to being right, and his common sense told him that a barn was the only way to save a horse. He had no category for engineering. That began beneath the grass. November arrived not with a roar, but with a sudden, bone-deep drop in pressure that turned the sky the color of a bruised plum. By the afternoon of the 14th, the temperature had plummeted 40 in 6 hours. A meteorological event later recorded as the Great Freeze of 1878. While the rest of the valley scrambled to reinforce their overground structures, Clara remained inside her cabin, maintaining a modest fire in the hearth. On the surface, the world was becoming a lethal landscape of ice and predatory hunger. The wolves, driven by a desperation that stripped away their natural caution, descended from the high timberline in a pack of nearly 30. They were not looking for sport, they were looking for the caloric heat of living bodies. From her window, Clara watched the first of them trot across her frozen paddock, its nose twitching as it searched for the scent of the 3 horses Miller had been so sure she had abandoned. The wolf paused directly over the spot where the Baymarari stood 8 feet below, separated by layers of compacted clay, stone, and the thermal barrier she had engineered. The predator found nothing. There was no scent of manure, no musk of animal sweat, and no sound of shifting hooves. The scent trap was functioning with a 98% efficiency rate. The intake pipe, buried deep enough to avoid the frost line, continued to pull in fresh, earth-warmed air while the exhaust was being scrubbed by the charcoal and flame of her fireplace. Inside the cabin, the floor was warm to the touch, a steady 60 maintained by the radiating body heat of the livestock below. It was a closed-loop system of mutual survival. The horses provided the heat that kept her floor from freezing, and she provided the carbon-filtered ventilation that kept them from suffocating. Outside, the blizzard finally broke, dumping 3 feet of dry crystalline snow that acted as a final layer of acoustic and thermal insulation. For 4 days, the cabin was an island of silence in a white void. Clara spent the time monitoring the grain levels and checking the stone arches for any sign of settling. The physics remained constant. The weight of the snow only added to the compressive strength of her vaulted ceiling. The silence was broken on the 5th day by the sound of frantic shouting and the heavy, uneven thud of a dying horse. Miller and 2 of his hands appeared through the drifts, their faces blackened by frostbite, leading a single gelding that was shivering so violently its joints clicked. Their own standard barns built of thin pine and exposed to the full force of the gale had failed. The livestock inside had either frozen or been picked off by wolves that had tunneled through the snow-blocked doors. Miller hammered on Clara's door, his breath coming in ragged frozen plumes. When she opened it, the heat from the cabin hit him like a physical weight, a stark contrast to the -30 air behind him. He pushed his way inside, his eyes wild as he looked around the small, sparse room. He was looking for the source of the warmth, expecting to see a roaring furnace or a stack of coal. Instead, he saw only a modest fire and a woman who didn't look like she was at the end of her rope. Miller demanded to know how it was so warm, and why her cabin didn't smell of wood smoke alone, but of something deeper, something vital. He noticed a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration in the floorboards, a soft, muffled thud that occurred every few seconds. It was the yearling below, shifting its weight in the sand. Thomas, who had accompanied Miller, knelt and pressed his hand to the floor. The look on his face was one of profound disorientation. "The ground is breathing, Miller," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking from the cold. He looked up at Clara, his skepticism replaced by a terrifying realization that he was standing on top of something he didn't understand. The open loop she had created weeks ago was finally closing. Miller stepped toward the hearth, noticing for the first time that the back of the chimney had been modified with a series of stone baffles he couldn't account for. He was a man who lived by the visible world and the invisibility of Clarara's solution was an insult to his authority. "Where are they, Clarara?" Miller asked, his voice low and dangerous, fueled by the loss of his own prize stock. He moved toward the center of the room, his heavy boots echoing on the boards. "You didn't sell them. No one could have moved horses in that first storm. If they're dead in the woods, the wolves would be howling at your doorstep, not circling the valley, but there isn't a track out there except for yours." And the packs to Clarara did not move from her position by the table. She waited until the wind rattled the rafters, a reminder of the lethality outside before she spoke. The requirement was a structure that could secure them from the elements and the predators. She said, her voice matter of fact and devoid of triumph. "You looked for a bomb because you think safety is something you build up. I knew safety was something you go into." She walked to the center of the room and pulled a hidden iron ring flush with the floorboards. With a rhythmic groan of the pulley system she had rigged, a 6-foot section of the floor swung upward on heavy leather hinges. A wave of humid animals' scented warmth billowed into the room. The smell of hay, horsehide, and life. Miller and Thomas recoiled as if she had opened a gate to another world. Below them, illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern hanging from a stone pillar, the 3 horses looked up, their eyes reflecting the light. They were calm, dry, and healthy. The stable was a masterpiece of primitive engineering. The walls were smooth, fear-hardened clay. The ceiling was a perfect Roman arch of dry stacked limestone, and the floor was a bed of clean, insulating sand. There was no frost, no dampness, and no fear. Thomas descended the ladder first, his fingers tracing the stones. He saw the ventilation, flue, the pre-warmed air intakes, and the way the entire structure used the cabin's own weight as an anchor. He turned back to Miller, who was still standing at the edge of the opening, staring down at the horses he had intended to seize. "It's not just a hole in the dirt, Miller," Thomas said, his voice hushed with a reluctant professional respect. "It's a mine. She's built a mine for the living." The immediate consequence of the reveal was a total collapse of Miller's social leverage. He could not seize the horses for being a nuisance when they were the most securely housed animals in the territory. Furthermore, the loss of the council's own livestock during the freeze had created a vacuum of power and a desperate need for a new standard of frontier architecture. As the snow began to melt in late February, the story of the hidden stable spread through the valley not as a tale of a widow's luck, but as a technical manual for survival. Neighbors who had once looked at Clarara's dirt moving with pity now writhed with notebooks and measuring tapes. They wanted to know the exact ratio of the clay to lime mix she used for the hardening process. They wanted to understand the physics of the chimney scrubber that had fooled the wolves' noses for 3 months. Clara did not charge them for the knowledge, but she did not offer it with sentimentality. She treated each inquiry like an engineering consultation. She showed them how to read the slope of their land to ensure drainage and how to calculate the thermal mass required to keep a yearling warm through a blizzard. By the following autumn, 7 other homesteads had begun excavating a Clar cells beneath their homes. The social reversal was complete. The woman who had been marked for exile was now the unofficial architect of the valleys. Resilience. Miller eventually moved further south, unable to reconcile his traditional views with the quiet subterranean success of the woman he had tried to break. The wolves returned the next winter, as they always do, but they found the valley changed. The scent of prey had vanished from the air, replaced by the neutral, stony smell of the earth. The predators moved on to easier ranges, leaving the settlement in a state of unprecedented quiet security. The legacy of the project was eventually codified in the territorial archives as the Frontier Substable System, though locals continued to call it the Clara Vault. By 1895, The practice of integrated subterranean livestock housing had become the standard for high-altitude homesteads across the territory, significantly reducing animal mortality rates during the brutal winters of the late 19th century. Documents from the period show that Clara eventually expanded her own system, connecting the stable to a root cellar and a spring-fed cooling room, creating a fully integrated thermal environment that required no external fuel beyond her daily cooking fire. She lived in that cabin for another 40 years, outlasting the mill, the stagecoach line, and most of the men who had doubted her. When the cabin was eventually dismantled in the mid-1900s to make way for a modern road, the demolition crew was baffled to find a perfectly preserved stone vault beneath the foundation, its arches still tight, and its ventilation shafts still clear of debris. They found no rot in the floorboards and no cracks in the clay walls. It was a testament to the fact that when engineering is aligned with the fundamental laws of physics, it does not require maintenance so much as it requires respect today. The site is marked by a simple bronze plaque that does not mention her struggle or her widowhood. Instead, it lists the dimensions of the vault and the calculated thermal efficiency of the airflow. It frames her story not as a triumph of the heart, but as a victory of the mind. A reminder that on the frontier, the most powerful tool a human possesses is the ability to look at a pile of dirt and see a fortress. The horses are long gone, and the walls are a memory. But the elegant logic of the hidden stable remains as a blueprint for anyone who finds themselves facing an unfair deadline with nothing but a shovel and the earth beneath their feet.